rejecting the kind of authority which had been traditional in Britain. There's a famous scene in their film Help where they make fun of an old gentleman in the railway carriage, and they just make fun of him, and he says, "I fought the war for people like you," and they just don't care. And that's a very important defining moment in the whole evolution of a less class-bound Britain. Now, The Servant, I think, does that first. The Servant comes before that, and really what it's pointing at, I suppose, is the kind of bankruptcy of the class that the James Fox character belongs to. These are people who have no function. They don't know where they're going. They're rootless. And there are others coming up who do have a sense that they want to have some of that power. They want to actually, take some of that power. This is a theme which a lot of British films would go on to explore, and I think we can see The Servant at the beginning of the decade as opening up a whole new, rich terrain, which would become one of the great themes of British cinema in the 60s and the 70s. The most obvious example, following up on that, of course, is another film that James Fox appears in, Performance, a film by Nick Roeg and Donald Cammell. I think the film has got a very interesting structure because it begins in the outside world. It begins in a kind of real London. There's even a joke at the very beginning of it where we see a sign which refers to the person who invented the modern toilet mechanism. It's a little joke. But we begin in a very real world, and then we move into a world which is increasingly bounded by the house. And it's a movement which I think is also something that you see in a film like L'Avventura. And I'm absolutely convinced that Losey had his eye fixed on these dramatic new kinds of filmmaking that were coming from Italy especially, because that evolution from a real world to a world which is eventually a kind of almost completely psychological world is the same pattern that we see in The Servant. And as the film progresses, the world becomes more hermetic, and we lose a sense of space and time, well, certainly of time, and the house becomes a kind of metaphor for the relationship, and so all the elements of decor in the house. And we shouldn't forget that this is also a film designed by Richard MacDonald, the great production designer who would work with Losey on all his major films, and so they're working very, very closely together. The production design is really an integral part of the way the film is constructed to focus us in on the disintegration of one character and the ever-growing power of the other character. And so there's a kind of relationship between the mental, the psychological plot and the physical plot. As the house becomes more Barrett's creation, so Tony becomes Barrett's creation, psychologically. It's a very interesting film in the way that it finds a kind of architectural structure to develop its psychological theme. This is what makes it, I think, so satisfying in many ways as a piece of filmmaking. It's very rare that you get this kind of perfect fusion between the script, the cinematography, and the production design. They're all achieving the same result. Well, I think that critics were very impressed by the film. I mean, the film had an undeniable power. And I think that there were those, of course, who saw it as morally questionable because they felt that really, they understood the message of the film. And if you do see the film as a kind of indictment of, a class that has ceased to function properly, then, of course, it's a pretty bleak message. And I think there were people who were prepared to say, well, we always knew that Joseph Losey was on the left, that he was a communist, and here we have a communist portrayal of the collapse of bourgeois society. And so it is open to that kind of reading, that it is a kind of critique of the wealthy classes who need to be pushed aside by the rising energy of the working class. But there's a big problem with understanding it that way, because Barrett, the Dirk Bogarde character, is not a simple member of the working class at all. He's a very sinister character, and there's something quite demonic about him. He seems to have a power, an energy. It's not simply that of being a working class person. He's very much into mind games. He's very subtle, he's very clever, and he belongs to a curious class, a class that, of course, people hadn't been thinking about for a long time. He's a servant. The title of the film is The Servant. Now, this was a period when most people in Britain had never seen a servant. Servants were not common They belong to the past. So here we have a figure coming from the past, a figure that we associate with, the Edwardian period or something like that, suddenly into the modern world. And that gives it a slightly kind of different inflection. I see it as a kind of Mephistopheles Faust subject as well. So I think that although people did see it as a Marxist film, some people did, I think it was also possible to read it as a kind of reworking of the old Mephistopheles Faust theme in a very new setting. But it is really about the possibility of somebody bringing out the worst in somebody else and exercising total magical control over them. So there is that dimension to the film as well. But I think mainly people felt that it was a great step forward in terms of British cinema growing up and really becoming the equal of the European cinemas. And people felt very proud of it for that reason, even if they thought that it was getting into dangerous moral territory.